Israel has carried out a strike on senior Hamas leaders in Qatar's capital, Doha. A Hamas official says its negotiating team was targeted in the attack. It's unclear whether any of them was killed, but photos and videos show a badly damaged building in the north of the city. Qatar, which has been mediating indirect negotiations between Israel and Hamas, called the attack a blatant violation of international law. In a statement, the Israel Defense Forces IDF said it conducted the precise strike and those targeted are directly responsible for the killings on October 7, as well as the shootings in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Israel has warned all residents in Gaza City to leave immediately in anticipation of a huge ground offensive. Well, the message from the Israel Defense Forces, both in leaflets dropped over Gaza City and from its Arabic spokesman, was unequivocal. The military's Arabic spokesman told as many as 1 million Palestinians living in Gaza's biggest urban center to evacuate southwards. It said remaining in the area is extremely dangerous. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said airstrikes that had destroyed high-rise buildings in Gaza City in recent days were only the beginning of the main intensive operation to capture what he has described as Hamas's last important stronghold. Hamas says his remarks amount to a public demonstration of a fully fledged crime of forced displacement.
Surprised this morning by dropped leaflets mentioning a humanitarian zone, they say. I don't know where such a zone is. If it exists, we would go there. But we don't feel like there is one. We hear that Al-Mawasi, the so-called humanitarian zone they're referring to, is also being bombarded. We don't know what to do, stay here or go there? I don't know, we're confused. There's fear here, and fear there too.
This morning, in addition to bombardments, we woke up to leaflets being dropped on our camp. Where should we go? We have been displaced 25 times. Where should we go? There is no place in the south, and transportation is expensive. We don't have money to move. Where should we go? Where should we go? Flee to the south? It's packed. People fled to the south and then returned to the north because there's no place there. How big is the south? How could it accommodate the entire population of the Gaza Strip? That's enough, enough. They've completely annihilated us in the Gaza Strip.
We'll cross live now to West Bank in Palestine and speak to the country director of Action Aid, Jamil Sawalmeh. Jamil, glad to have you join us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you could speak up a little bit more so I can hear you clearly. But by the way, 70 people are said to be leaving, to wherever. But then it's a place where you have 1 million people. I mean, that's like a drop in the ocean. What can you tell us about what's happening in Gaza?
Well, unfortunately, we are finding ourselves yet again in the face of another wave of forcible displacement. When we talk about 1 million people in Gaza City are now being forcibly displaced or are being asked to evacuate Gaza City in the face of the intended military offensive in Gaza City. This is a very complex reality based on what we are hearing on the ground from our colleagues as well as our partners, local partners who are operating in Gaza City currently, is that the civilian populations are being pushed from everywhere to nowhere. There is no safe zone in area, and the so-called humanitarian zones that the Israeli army have announced, these are nowhere to be in safe or humanitarian. We know that Israel continued to carry out strikes in these humanitarian zones, killing people, killing entire families in their shelter tents and their makeshift shelters in these areas. And we know that this is also happening in the middle of a famine that was declared in Gaza City. We know that nearly 500,000 people are now suffering extreme famine and starvation in Gaza City. So therefore, the humanitarian conditions in Gaza are now further throwing the civilian population into despair. They are being pushed to areas where there is lack of resources, there is no shelter services whatsoever. And we know that the area that the Israeli army have pushed the civilians to, which is the central area of Gaza City, of Gaza Strip, is also on the brink of being declared as a famine area, as per the IPC report that was recently issued, which also considers that area to be likely to face famine by the end of September. So this is a very complex reality that we are facing with the civilian populations, and also further also complicates our humanitarian operations in terms of serving and providing humanitarian aid in those areas.
And that's exactly where I was going to go to next. How has all this, the picture you painted, impacted Action Aid's work?
Well, of course, our staff on the ground are also facing the same dire situation as everybody else in Gaza City. The same goes for our local partners who will continue to be on the forefront of the humanitarian response and continue to provide humanitarian aid. So the situation for them is not safe. Our operation is being very much hindered by the continued military operation. It's being hindered by the obstruction of movement. It's being hindered also by the continued blockade and the closure of all crossings, preventing humanitarian aid from entering into Gaza. Therefore, speaking to our local partners in Gaza City, we know that most of them have decided to stay in the city and serve the civilian populations who are having no place to go. And we know from our information on the ground that there's a huge number of people who have decided to stay in Gaza City because basically they have no options. They have nowhere safe to go, and therefore they have decided to stay there. And our local partners, as well as our Action Aid teams, are also continuing to provide critical life-saving services in there with whatever is available in the middle of this very dire and complex situation. Therefore, I think it's very important for us to highlight the fact that every day the situation is getting worse, is getting more complicated for us as humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza, and that's all because of the current blockade and the continued aerial and naval bombardment and military operations in Gaza.
Yeah, just like you said, I've read some of them saying that if we even had a place to go, we will go, and some of them saying that this is our land. I'm going to stay here. If I'm going to die, I will die in my land. So you've been speaking to, I guess, some of them. So what's been their reaction? What's the feeling like?
Well, the feeling is very dire, as you have seen from the testimonies you have collected from civilians in Gaza. The fact that these people have been repeatedly displaced, forcibly displaced over the past 23 months of this war. They have been thrown from one corner to another, from the north to the center, then to the south, and then back to the north. And amid of all this forcible displacement, we are talking about dire humanitarian conditions. We're talking about lack of shelter services, lack of shelter items, lack of food, lack of clean water supply, and also lack of safety and security because people are being killed everywhere. And therefore, the feelings that we are getting from the civilians that they are now being thrown into more despair and they have nowhere else to go. And we don't really see that it is actually moral or it's actually in line with any sort of humanitarian principles to push 1 million people out of a very crowded city that is rendered to rubble. Even most of the people living in Gaza City are living in dire conditions. They're not living in houses or apartments. They're living in tents and makeshift temporary shelters. Therefore, these conditions that the civilians are describing, they're also applied to everybody else in Gaza. And sending them to an area that is already crowded with forcibly displaced people that lack services is no less than a crime, of course.
You're on the ground. Action Aid is on the ground. I mean, listen to Netanyahu at times, or the ambassador to Israel here in Nigeria say that Hamas is actually the one blocking aid and not Israel. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, based on the situation on the ground, we have first of all to address the issue of the blockade. There is a total blockade imposed by the Israeli army on the crossings into Gaza. And we know that thousands and thousands of metric tons of aid are piled up on the borders of Gaza City waiting for clearance by the Israeli army. So first and foremost, we have to address that issue. We cannot say that humanitarian aid is being transported into Gaza. We know that from our recent statistics of the Association of International Development Agencies in Palestine, more than 70% of the clearance requests submitted to the Israeli army were denied. And we are seeing very little number of trucks being transported into Gaza, and unfortunately they are being transported through dangerous combat areas, and they are being directed by the Israeli army to areas where it's known to be where there's gang activities or looting activities. Therefore, we cannot say that Israel is allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza. And I think what enables the unhindered and at a scale flow of humanitarian aid is definitely the complete cessation of hostility, a permanent ceasefire, and a total opening of the crossings to Gaza.
What really is Israel's reason for not allowing aid, at least, to enter into Gaza? What are they telling you? Why are they stopping aid from people from accessing aid?
Well, of course, we know that Israel has weaponized humanitarian aids. We know that they are using the blockade as means to do collective punishment for the civilian population in Gaza. And we know that Israel has weaponized aid in cooperation with US contractors in the establishment of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And these are the so-called humanitarian distribution sites run by the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, ended up being killing zone. And we have seen that there are hundreds and hundreds of cases documented of people being killed in the vicinity of these aid distribution centers. And if we look at the quantities that were even distributed in these centers, they're not even a drop in an ocean of needs. Therefore, there is no excuse whatsoever to stop or block humanitarian aid. This is actually a principle that states have to maintain in the cases of war, that they have to allow humanitarian aid to flow freely. And we have to acknowledge the fact that the humanitarian system, including the work of Action Aid, has enough capacity, logistical and human resources capacity, to transport and deliver aid. However, Israel has been intentionally blocking that aid, also undermining the work of UN agencies and international agencies like Action Aid.
And that's the next thing. If I let you go, has the international community done enough? What more can they do concerning the humanitarian crisis, or even stopping this war that looks like is looking every day like Israel are not quite don't want to stop the war?
Yeah. Well, we definitely welcome any additional measures being called for from any third states. For example, the EU member states or any other state in the world for the call for a permanent and sustainable ceasefire. We welcome all these diplomatic and political efforts being put forward by these countries. However, we don't see that the world has done enough. There is a shared responsibility for third states to immediately intervene and to actually adopt meaningful action that can exert additional political and diplomatic pressure on Israel to stop this war. I mean, the flow of humanitarian aid is important, but the flow of humanitarian aid with the continued airstrikes and continued killing of people is not going to solve or stop the war. We need, actions from these countries to pressure Israel to stop the war. And definitely we call upon the world to do whatever they can do under their obligation for being third states, and also the United Nations as well, to use their diplomatic and political channels to work with third states who have influence in Israel to stop the current war and to reach a stage where we have a sustainable and permanent ceasefire for us to be able to deal with the massive level of humanitarian needs. Because we know that we need years upon years, if the war stops tomorrow, to deal with the size of humanitarian needs. So this is an open call for all states around the world to be using the maximum that they can use in terms of political and diplomatic pressure to stop the war.
Country Director, Action Aid, Jamil Sawalmeh, thank you for your time on The World.
Thanks for having me, sir.